I know that you have been talking a lot about the fentanyl crisis in America. It's something we've been covering a lot on this show. And the Biden administration seems very disinterested in doing anything about it. If they cared about the fentanyl crisis that's killing thousands of Americans, they would secure our border for starters, but they're not.
Yeah, so I think, let me just I'm going to distill this down to the essential points here. First of all, we need to understand the history of this entire crisis. So if you go back to 1913 is when the FDA was founded. In 1970 is when the Controlled Substance Act was put into place by the Nixon administration. And at that same point is when the DEA was created. And there was a very interesting drug, which was like aspirin, that had been used even before the FDA, called diacetyl morphine. You've heard of morphine. Diacetyl morphine was essentially taking the morphine and attaching two acetyl groups. And that had been used, believe it or not, very people would use it like aspirin. There wasn't all this rampant addiction, and it was used for pain. So that's a background. Now, when the DEA gets created in 1970, guess what they do? They do something quite interesting. They declare that diacetyl morphine, which was used for chronic pain by Americans for many, many years, even before 1913, was essentially now a Schedule I substance that even doctors could not prescribe. So all these people with chronic pain, we were like aspirin, they were using diacetyl morphine, which is essentially morphine, but with two diacetyl groups, which means when you take it, it essentially becomes morphine. And then they rebranded that substance as heroin. So it's the first time I think ever they've taken a generic and they branded it as heroin. So now suddenly heroin has this halo effect and people have to go to the streets to get it. So it literally created a product on the streets, and the DEA starts explosively growing, and this becomes so-called this drug that no one should be taking, when if you really look at it, was diacetyl morphine, which had existed for many, many years. So heroin use is explosively growing. And by the way, you can get morphine for very cheap. Heroin, which is this exact same diacetyl morphine, is selling for 1,000 times more. So drug dealers are making a ton of money, and heroin sales are explosively growing. Then something very, very interesting happens. Probably Purdue Pharma, which was started by the Sacklers. They put out a drug called Oxycontin, and Oxycodone or Oxycontin, which is there's the same drug. One is a timed release version of it, which slowly releases. You take 2 pills, and Oxycodone. And interesting enough, even though I'm not a big promoter of big pharma, Oxycontin was heavily tested. It went through clinical trials. People figured out the right dosaging, and it was for chronic pain, and doctors were essentially offering that. Guess what happens when Oxycodone comes out? Heroin sales literally heroin on the street plummets by 50% because now doctors could actually offer patients something for chronic pain. 60% of the people were using diacetyl morphine, aka heroin, were using it because they actually had chronic pain. So now they could go to their doctors and legally get it prescribed.